Hello, and thanks for joining us for this month's edition of The Scope of Things, a no-nonsense look at the realities and enigmas of clinical research based on those closest to the action who aim for great and, if need be, are willing to shake things up. I'm Deborah Borfitz, Senior Science Writer for Clinical Research News. In today's episode, I'll be speaking with Gerald Finken, founder and CEO of digital health startup RxE2, whose mission is to integrate the practice of pharmacy into every aspect of clinical trials. Welcome to the podcast, Gerald.
Thank you. Really great to be here. Thank you.
Now, to better frame this conversation going in, it might be helpful to get a little background on why pharmacists have historically played a minor role at best in clinical research, which, for the most part, is about drugs, their specialty. Who missed the boat here?
Yeah, it's a big boat. And maybe we'll get the next one. But wait, I go back. I've been in the industry for quite a while. Mm-hmm. And I remember when I started, the FDA commissioner just made the statement that clinical supplies had to be packaged and labeled under GMP requirements. And it was interesting because at the time we were doing that with lab notebooks. And so the whole industry changed overnight. But there's an awful lot going on in the industry. And one of the things, as a pharmacist in the industry, I remember one of the things that I didn't quite understand at the time, but in the last decade really understood a little bit better. And that is, it was back in the early 80s or mid 80s when the APHA, which was the American Pharmaceutical Association, split. And so it was the American Pharmaceutical Association and the American Pharmacist Science or something like the APS. And they split into two different organizations. One being the American Pharmacists Association, which everybody knows today if you're a practicing pharmacist, and then, of course, the AAPS. So for me, I was looking about getting my PhD, and so I was thinking at the time as a pharmacist going on for my PhD, of course, and I'd be part of the AAPS. But at the time, if you think about it, like the practice of pharmacy, pharmacists in the community then went into the community, and pharmacists and PhDs and other formulation scientist stuff went into the formulation side of things. So I want to say it was a big change at the time, but I sometimes think that's the catalyst that's separated, why pharmacists don't have a role in the industry today, because it separated. Pharmacists went the way of just community, and the formulation scientists, of course, went hardcore science into the farm dev and the development. But Deborah, when I think about that, one of the things that I've seen, when I think about this, is where we've gone wrong is that, all the issues around compounding today, I don't think we'd have, and this is pharmacist compounding, I don't think we'd have if the formulation scientists were part of the compounding. But I also say on the flip side of that, I don't think we'd have so much of the adherence compliance problems in clinical trials that we have today if the pharmacists who knew how to counsel and work with patients were involved today. Mm-hmm. So there was a missed boat, but it's one of those things that just, it happens a little bit, and then we get this is the way it's going to be. And so then we don't even ask about it again until someone like me comes along and say, hey, wait a minute. What are we doing?
We went wrong somewhere. Yeah. So how do you imagine studies would look different if pharmacists were part of the team? Would recruitment woes of sponsors be soothed? Would safety signals be picked up on better or sooner? Or would study participants be more likely to comply with the protocol, which is what I think you were just implying? What fundamentally changes?
I always talk about the major strategic aspects of the time, cost, quality for the industry, and when I say that, I'll just briefly say, so I've been in the industry 40 years, and 40 years ago it cost $500 million to get a drug approved. 7 to 14 years, 9 out of 10 drugs failed, right? And then you move forward, you fast forward to where we are today. It costs $3 billion, depending on the numbers. 7 to 14 years to get a drug approved. 9 out of 10 drugs fail. Yeah. And so it's let's really take a look at this and step back to say, how can we improve this? So as a pharmacist along the way, I look at it and said, in the clinical supply area, and we actually did do counseling of patients in clinical trials. I personally know, or I firmly believe that if pharmacists are involved, some of the issues that we're having today in clinical trials wouldn't exist. I don't think recruitment would be a problem. I don't think adherence and compliance would be a problem because pharmacists were trained right? And medication experts who are trained to counsel patients find out things real time, right? And they know what questions asked. They know when they ask a patient, like, how are you feeling today? Okay. Like, wait a minute, like that okay wasn't really okay. And so they ask the next question, and especially when it comes about medications. And so for me, I think some of the big strategic issues, especially of quality and time, we wouldn't have the same issues today if the pharmacists were involved, from 1986 on.
What about the use of digital devices like glucose monitors and other wearables in trials? Like, where does this fit into the picture? And if pharmacists were involved, how different would it look?
Yeah, great aspect, or to consider, because pharmacists. When I think about it in a pharmacy, it's not just about drugs. Because if you think about the glucose meters, right? Where's everybody getting those? They're going to the pharmacy. And most importantly, even if they get them from the doctor's office, when something goes wrong, where do they take them? Back to the pharmacist.
Right.
And so for me, when I think about even with devices, it's no different than with the medications, is that the pharmacists have a different counseling method, for working with patients in years of experience of, working with patients and their issues. And so what happens is they know what questions to ask, more open-ended questions, hear from the patient. And so if they're having problems with devices, just, improper use, and are using another device they're not supposed to, pharmacists would know about this. And so I see it hand in hand, the digital medicine along with the actual devices and the drugs all falling into the same category, that these we'd be much further along in the trials.
Yeah. Do pharmacists want this responsibility? I mean, what's in it for them, so to speak?
Yeah. So as we're finding out every day, the pharmacists, as we know, they're always dispensing. Yeah. So we also know with COVID, what just happened, the success of the vaccination was all about pharmacists. Most importantly, the independent community pharmacists, yep, who took on the role of being a provider, being able to actually do the injections. And so for pharmacists, by being able to offer their patients, their customers, services like the vaccines, they're all about coming out from behind the counter to offer more services, whether it's MTM, MedSync programs, anything they can do, even to find cheaper prices or coupons, for the patients. They really are more than just behind the counter dispensing. They're trying to do everything they can for their patients. And so we start approaching these independent community stores about this opportunity to say, listen, you have this option to get your patients into clinical trials, these great places to get healthcare. They love it in the fact that they can, give their community, their patients, their customers another option for their healthcare. Mm-hmm. More importantly, probably not more important, at the same token, because it's first of all patients first. Then they say, "Wait, this is a pretty good revenue stream. There could be, a different way of getting paid for our cognitive services," and they're very, very excited about that.
Yeah, yeah. And you have some examples of some pharmacists that have successfully done this to date?
Yes, actually, it's pretty exciting in that just about every other week, we're sent an ad that some local pharmacist ran about working with RxE2 and how this is really good for their patients and a nice revenue stream. And so unbeknownst to us, we get these YouTube videos, other videos that they're sending to fellow pharmacists throughout their states, or sharing with their organizations to say, listen, this is really a great thing. And so for us, I'm really excited about that, because we're not selling to the pharmacists. We're getting more and more pharmacists on our platform by word of mouth, and their excitement about this than us have to physically go out there and sell to them.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So it's really kind of unique and exciting, that it's I call it a big wave, and we're just coming up in the wave, and the pharmacists are going to take this forward.
Mm-hmm. And I'm going to ask you in a minute about the facilitating that RxE2 does and get into more specifics. But let me ask you this first, because I recall you telling me when we spoke earlier this year that decentralized clinical trials are going to need the involvement of pharmacists in the community, since drugs are being shipped to people's homes, and therefore state laws kick in requiring patient counseling and patient-specific labeling. So can you tell me more about that, and if you've seen study sponsors engaging pharmacists for precisely this reason yet?
It's coming.
Okay.
The decentralized trials is a great concept that is necessary. And the idea of like going outside the academic institution. But the moment you start doing that, like decentralized, talk about like expanding the horizon of a site, from 20 miles to 50 miles to across state lines.
Yeah.
And so the decentralized trials, one of the first things they ran up against was that a doctor in California can't talk to a patient in Nevada. And so what they came out, what we're finding out is that, all of us in the clinical trials, we know GMP and GCP. But for the first time at the higher levels, we realize, oh, wait, there are these things called state laws. And if you think about it, the FDA is all about training. Anybody can do anything as long as they're trained and it's documented.
Yeah.
But when you actually come down to like those clinical sites that are doing the investigation, they're following the state laws. Like a nurse can't diagnose a patient. No, because by law, they can't do that.
Right.
And so one of the things I think for like decentralized trials, one of the first things they found out is like through telehealth, no, you have to be licensed in the state to be able to talk to that patient in the state. Now, there's things you can do to get multiple licenses, et cetera. Like I was licensed in 10 states, for that very reason. Years ago, we were working on working with the clinical supplies.
Yeah.
So anyhow, you take this forward, then you say, okay, from a dispensing point of view, what is the role of the doctor? What is the role of the pharmacist? What is the role of the nurse? And so when I think about like clinical supplies and they were like sent to a clinical site, well, then we were all done. No one really thought about, well, how did that medication then get to the patient? Like who's dispensing? We said, well, the doctor's doing that.
Mm-hmm.
But as you start digging deeper into this and you start to get into decentralized clinical trials where now we're doing like medications directly to a patient, now we're finding like, oh, you can't do that.
Yeah.
So when we
missing pieces.
So when we sent medication to a doctor's office, in my previous company, we sent medication to a doctor's office. We had a distribution license. We could do that by sending, drugs across state lines to a doctor.
Mm-hmm.
But then when a doctor gives that medication to a patient, that falls under the practice of pharmacy. And so now if I'm going to be sending direct to a patient, I have to be licensed as a pharmacy to dispense because in most states, it's a pharmacy license you need to dispense medication.
Mm.
So in many states, like doctors and nurses are not allowed to dispense, right? It's only pharmacists that can dispense. They can administer, but they can't dispense. Mm-hmm. And that's a state by state regulation and varies. Like even with the nurses going to a patient's home, it's only the nurse practitioner that can actually dispense medications. Nurses can administer across many states, but many states don't allow the dispensing of medications. So these are things that is going to come to light, and hopefully it'll come to light before we're forced to see it, like we did with the New England Compounding Center, where patients had to die before we realized compounding that was going on was a little bit more like manufacturing.
Right. You don't want to hear about this on the evening news. Yeah. Okay. And I do want to jump into what RxE2 is doing to facilitate, all of this, getting community pharmacists involved in the clinical research enterprise. I know the company was intending to partner with technology providers, getting back to the decentralized model, Metadata, Science 37, Medable, to enable clinical trials in patients' home and their local pharmacy, as well as to collaborate with some of those independent pharmacists and potentially supermarket chains with pharmacies, and eventually take on the big box stores like CVS and Walgreens, who have been getting more active in the clinical research field. So has anything happened in the way of partnerships yet? And is there really room for everyone to make a play?
Yeah. Well, there's a lot to that one. Okay. So let's
bite it up in chunks.
Yeah. So first of all, when we think about the independent community stores, because that's what RxE2 is we're representing the independent community stores. Mm-hmm. And the NCPA just released their annual report that said there's 19,600 community stores in the U.S., independent community stores. So with CVS, Walgreens, and Rite Aid, the three of them combined have about 20,000. So you have those three big box stores, pharmacies, and then you have your independent community stores on the other side, representing about the same patient populations. But more importantly, like for us, and you start thinking about like DCTs, and we talk about, who we're going to partner with and our partnering is that. For us, when you think about decentralized clinical trials, we want to get into the flyover states. We want to get into those, like I always say, I want to be in Rugby, North Dakota with a clinical trial because there are patients there that need to get into a clinical trial. Mm-hmm. And so for us, one of the things as a technology company, and you have to realize is that there are a lot of great companies like Science 37 out there that really is driving decentralized clinical trials and other companies. And for them, like what they've done is made it easier so you can have multiple locations to collect data on a single platform. And so they're getting better and better at making it easier and easier for healthcare professionals, patients, et cetera, to enter data on a single platform. Now, for us at RxE2, we don't need to recreate that. There's already great companies like Science 37, like I said, and Edibles and stuff that are doing that have that. For us at RxE2, we built our platform that is all pharmacy-facing and patient-facing. And then through APIs, we'll connect to those great companies out there that are delivering DCTs and even to the CROs that are out there, delivering these services. Okay. So for me, what I'm trying to do is give access, like everybody talks about the 85% of the patients don't participate in clinical trials. It's like, I'm going to give us the ability to go out to those patients and get them involved in clinical trials. But there's a key element here that we can't forget that is really quintessential to the success of RxE2 and work with independent community stores versus other big box stores, et cetera. And that is this whole idea of trust. Mm-hmm. So the clinicians have it in their clinical sites, but they have a limited patient population.
Right.
So what would happen if we can expand that out to the local community pharmacies, which there's dozens, if not hundreds, around current academic institutions, or out in Rugby, North Dakota, where now we can go further through telehealth with a doctor talking to a patient in Rugby, North Dakota, but there's a pharmacist and a pharmacy in Rugby, North Dakota. That's the bricks and mortar where some of the assessments can be done, some of the tests can be done. And it's local and the patient stays local. And we needed a platform to make sure those pharmacists have the ability, first of all, to find those patients, get those patients, and work with those patients to be able to then talk to those big, great companies out there that are delivering decentralized clinical trials.
You call this an electronic pharmacy record, correct? Is that part of the platform or is that the platform?
Oh, this is a great question again. Okay. So for us, no, it's critical. This is, I think is going to be a key piece here is that right now, pharmacists, most of the data we use is dispensing data. And that's where like CVS and Walgreens, they got into this because they're using the dispensing data.
Right.
Now they have a different model. I mean, I love it because their pharmacy, the pharmacy getting involved in clinical trials took down a big hurdle for RxE2. By now, like pharmacists getting involved in clinical trials. Oh yeah, Walgreens do it. Yeah, this is great. So like, okay, everybody accepts that this happens, but their model's a little bit different in that they're creating like new clinics, hiring doctors and nurse practitioners, et cetera, to run those clinics.
Right.
They're not really involving the pharmacist, which they will maybe in time, which then makes our model, again, still unique in the fact that we're going to be using pharmacists to help with the clinical trials, to do all the extra that we can do, and that expertise that we can bring to a clinical trial, in addition to the clinician and the nurse that's already involved in a clinical trial. Okay. So it's a unique model. And again, this e-care plan that you talked about is very important because it's dispensing data we're using today, but all the states are getting involved in the e-care plans, they're calling them. And what that means is we need access to the health data that we can better counsel patients. We can do the better medication therapy management sessions and the counseling and to knowing just some key elements. Mm-hmm. And so the interesting thing is like they're trying to get access to electronic health records, but we know how crazy that is. And so really what we're looking to do is build a new platform with just like 10 key elements that like patients really, you need from the patient to do a better counseling. So yes, they had an MRI and it's great that that's part of electronic health record, but to help them with their medication, that MRI really doesn't, I don't need to have that in front of me to counsel a patient on their hypertension medication.
Yeah. And of these tens of thousands of independent pharmacies out there, how many are using your platform currently? And what sort of?
This is a great question. In fact, that it's like twofold where we are today. So we have 4,000 pharmacies contracted to work with today.
Wow.
And we're working with like 600 of them right now. And we're so excited to say, like, for the first time ever, pharmacists have referred patients and got them recruited into clinical trials. So it's a first. We've done it. We're doing this. And but of those 4,000, I've done no selling. Like it's by kind of like word of mouth, and various groups get together and say, like, we want to be part of this. And so it really is a wonderful thing to see this spread. Now, one day I'm hoping to have all 19,600 on our platform, but that's all going to be about how it really is about, again, this trust. Pharmacists and patients, they have this trust factor, and pharmacists have trust factors in some of their associations. RxE2 right now is building a great trust with the associations and with the stores. And until, like, by word of mouth that we get momentum, they're saying, no, this company's good to go, then we're going to see it mushroom. So I really think that we'll get the 10,000 pharmacies and be bigger than any of the big box stores by being able to have these pharmacies on our platform. But you have to understand, they're all independent. They're each their own little store.
Right.
And so our platform is all about simplicity and being very concise. Because if I could digress a little bit here, you have to understand in pharmacy that it's a little bit different the way things work. In a clinic, you go in and you think about a 20-minute, 30-minute visit. In pharmacy, it's 2 minutes, 2 minutes, 2 minutes.
Right.
And so for us, we've got to keep the attention of the pharmacist for 2 minutes. If we don't, they're going to leave and go fill a prescription. So we have to fit our technology into their daily routines, which is in like 2-minute increments.
Yes. And everybody likes the need for speed.
Yeah. And so far we've been able to do a pretty good job. And we got a lot of great feedback about our platform and how smoothly it runs and being able to upload data, get information back. So it's working really well. And again, a lot of really good feedback from the pharmacists.
That's great to hear. Now, paint me a picture of what, some of these newfangled clinical trials might look like. It sounds a minute ago like a pharmacist was serving as an actual principal investigator, through and through, versus working in collaboration with, I don't know, an academic center or a dedicated research center. How do you imagine it working? Maybe there's a couple different variations on that theme, or do they pick up just certain pieces of the process, or are they more often or less often, kind of doing the whole ball of wax, if you will?
So I had my dream about where I wanted to be, where the pharmacist PI. And I use that because, like, if you ever look up the definition of investigator, the FDA, it actually suits the pharmacist better than the doctor, right? Because in there it talks about like who oversees the study, but in there it says specifically, it talks about the one who oversees the administration or dispensing of the drug to a subject.
Yeah, that doesn't describe a pharmacist. What does, right?
And so it's like drug to a patient. Okay. So ultimately, that's where I want to go. But the reality is, it's going to be the whole gamut. It's really going to be how the industry accepts this and accepts risks and perception changes. And so for us, like at RxE2, if I came out and said, we're going to pharmacists be the PI and run the trials, that might be a financially successful play, for like raising money and stuff, but I don't see it necessarily as a clinically significant or successful play. And that is because we know clinical trials are extremely complicated. And so for us, it's like first things first. And so if we can help refer patients to a clinical trial, and we can take over the drug supply aspects, which is absolutely low-hanging fruit and within our scope of work, then there's this trust factor starts building. Like, oh yeah. And then pharmacists, while you're dispensing that medication, can you then counsel that patient? Sure, we can. And even in referral of patients, like we refer patients to a clinical site. For us, our model is not going to be like over 18 months. It's going to be like 8 weeks. We're going to recruit a study. And clinical sites aren't ready for that. Well, the industry's not ready for that. And so it's like going to be a step-by-step, I believe, acceptance of how we're going to get this done. And like I said, most importantly, it's going to be about like misconceptions about like the role of the doctor. The doctor has to be responsible for everything. It's like, no, if you go by the state laws, the doctor is responsible for a very small portion of the trial. Now, responsibility, of course, falls on the doctor, but responsibility can fall on a lot of people. And this is where like decentralized trials are finding that out. They talk about hybrid trials. It wasn't like totally virtual trials or, we're all going to go there. It's become a mix. Right. Hybrids. Yeah. Yeah. Hybrids. Yep. Which you already had on one of your podcasts, right? Where you talked about these very things. Yep. So I see the same thing. It'll be is in the next few years, when we get pharmacists involved, it'll be a big win. Yeah. And that's going to be a foot in the door to go next step. So we eventually get to the doctor-patient pharmacist triad, just like in the commercial world. Once a drug's approved, the pharmacist is absolutely involved. So let's bring the pharmacist in the clinical trial.
Yeah. So, is anyone outright against this idea? Are there any dog fights coming over this?
It's wonderful being in the healthcare professions, because first and foremost, like when I think about our competition, or I think about, like you say, dog fights, everybody thinks about the patient first. And if we can find a better way to help the patients, everybody's in.
Yeah.
And so the dog fight, I think, is getting back to what I think I was kind of alluding to about the perception. The dog fight is, can we change? We get very secure in our current practices. And of course, then I've read some protocols recently. It's so complicated in the way they're trying to ship drugs to a patient. It's blows my mind.
Mm-hmm. And
it's we could do this much simpler, because it's done every day in a community pharmacy, thousands and thousands of times. And it's just efficient. It's commoditized, I call it.
Yeah.
So I think the dog fight's going to is overcoming the misunderstandings, the misconceptions about what it is versus what it could be.
Right.
And not that I think there's going to be an outright, because it's not a regulatory issue. Again, as one of your other podcasts you're alluding to, with Craig Lipset was talking about the regulatory aspects of this. Yeah. There's not the regulatory stuff that's going to hold us back, and that's most of the biggest risk.
Yeah, yeah.
And so I don't. There'll be dog fights, but it'll be more of, that's not the way we do it.
Yeah, yeah. Very good. When I invited you on the show, you indicated that RxE2 has learned a lot about pharmacists' involvement in clinical trials over the past few months, some good and some not so good. So I'd like to end with what the big lessons learned have been to date on this journey, if you would.
Okay. First of all, I'm just so excited about the pharmacists that they're embracing this and giving us feedback that they're impatient. We're doing referrals right now, and they're saying, wait a minute, I could do this, this, and this. It's they want to start taking on clinical trials today. So I was okay, hold on. First things first here. So that was really nice. Probably, I'm just going to say this, from our perspective, lessons learned, our naivety. We're doing this referral process, and we have a 3-step process. First of all, of course, we have access to the pharmacy's data. They upload it to us. We use our algorithms, et cetera, to find patients for a clinical trial based upon a protocol and the algorithms we've written. And we send that back to the pharmacist. So we give them a list of 25 patients that could be eligible for a clinical trial. So there's a first pass quality step that says, all the other patients they have are excluded except for these 25. Then the pharmacist takes a look at those 25. And because independent community stores, they most know all the patients, they look at them and say, these 5 patients, I know, that's not, they're on that medication, but that's not what the indication is for. So they remove, maybe 10 of those patients before then getting to the next level, which then does an inclusion exclusion criteria call. So now you've got this medication expert doing the inclusion exclusion call with the patient to do a final super qualification to say that, 5 of those patients actually qualify for the clinical trial. So then the pharmacist calls the clinical site, and we've had this, they call the clinical site, they do a warm handoff, they give them to the site. And then a week later, a patient comes in and says no, the site never called me. And we were dug into it deeper, and we referred dozens and dozens of patients that the sites never followed up with.
Interesting.
And it just blew my mind. He had these super qualified patients, and the site didn't bring them on, screen them. And so, of course, if you don't talk to a patient in 2 weeks, they're gone.
Yep.
And so our naivety, I just assumed when we had these really super great patients that the sites would just take them. And it isn't that the sites are very busy. Yeah. And it didn't, we found out all the reasons why this is happening. So what we did is we corrected it, and we're going to make sure we don't make that mistake again. And as soon as we changed that model, patients were getting recruited. So really, that was a lesson learned for sure. So I guess that would be the big lesson learned.
Okay, and that is a good one. Recruitment is an ongoing, forever problem. So that is good to hear. You're moving the needle.
Yeah.
And really, Gerald, it is indeed a brand new world out there, and RxE2 is on the very cutting edge of it, it so seems. I am anxious to see how all this plays out in the coming months, so please let's stay in touch. Thank you so much for agreeing to be a guest on the show today, and good luck in righting the ship for the research enterprise of tomorrow.
Yeah, get on the next boat.
Absolutely. I'll be there.
Thank you so much, Deborah.
Doc waving at you. As always, a big thank you to everyone out there for listening in. If you like this conversation, it is only a glimpse of what you can expect from the presenters and panelists we have on tap for Scope Europe. Please plan to join us October 3rd and 4th in Barcelona, when clinical operations executives will be sharing best practices and discussing the new era of decentralized, analytics-driven, and patient-centric clinical trials. Save an additional 10% with the code PODCAST. For more information, visit scopesummiteurope.com. Bye for now.